Lisa, welcome to the Best in Property podcast. Thank you very much for your time. How is everything going on your side?
It's good. Thanks for having me, Jake. It's great to be here today. Thank you.
No problem at all. Well, we're just talking off camera then, basically, about the, demand for supported living right now. And, and obviously I was curious and fascinated to hear more about, from your perspective, supported living. And, supported living is obviously, there's a lot to talk about it. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of exciting things going on. And of course, when there's excitement, there's obviously parties or individuals that want to come into the sector that may or may not do it as well as others. Where do you see supported living right now? Because, I was on your supported living gateway. I was on your webinar the other month, really, and that was fascinating again to go more into detail. But where do you see the sector right now in terms of whole as a generic term with supported living at the moment?
I think there's massive demand for properties. That's what I see. Obviously, I see it more from the property perspective than some of the other angles that you can look at supported living in. But I think that it's still a massive growth area. There's still a lot of funding being thrown at it by central government and by local governments who have a big desire to get people out of long-term institutional settings and get them into homes of their own. So the conversations I have every day with providers is that there is massive demand still, and that it's a sector that's got a lot of growth in it. So I think, which is why it's exciting, and I think it's why lots of people are talking about it.
For sure. Something which I don't know if you agree with, actually, Lisa. You look at property investment strategies. There's a lot of, if we put sort of care and sort of supported living sort of with tenants to the side of the second, and we look at the property side of it, the investment side of it. You look at COVID, for example, SA was hit, service accommodation was massively hit. HMO, so I know a lot of people do rent or they own HMOs, was massively hit. Student was, of course, another one that was hit. Commercial, again, obviously that's bounced back slightly, but do you think COVID actually had a positive effect on supported living with the actual match? Because I think now people are looking at, they looked at SA, which is of course bounced back, but at the time, I think it was like, well, where do you get your security from? Where's is the security? And obviously supported living, answer that question in many ways. If you get it right, of course, it's not plain sailing all the time. But what's your thoughts on that sort of stance when it comes to sort of COVID actually maybe having a positive effect on supported living?
Yeah, I think it made a lot of people stop and think. I think it made people redress some of their property strategies and realize what they thought was a really rock solid strategy perhaps wasn't so good. And I think certainly the people I know with social housing and with supported housing properties didn't really concern. They weren't worried about the fact their rent wasn't going to be paid. It was still coming in every month from the local authority. So I do think it gives a more balanced structure. I also think COVID made a lot of people stop and redress, just generally, not necessarily from a property point of view, but about what they want from life and what they're trying to achieve. And I think it was a real time, and still is, isn't it, a time for a lot of people reassessing their lives, really. And I think getting involved in supported living from a property investor point of view allows you to do something really positive. And I think that it feels to me like people are really looking for that at the moment, looking for ways to make a difference. And I think that's something that COVID has, in a way that's COVID has affected people too.
For sure. We talk about briefly on camera again about providers, and I think there's a lot of providers. I know that's something that you guys are linking the dots and connecting the dots between obviously what you do at Supported Living Gateway, between investors, providers, etc. But providers, there is a lot of them. There is, of course, you can go to any board or any council. There's a million one different providers you can work with. What have you seen in terms of providers, that the sort of journey of providers over the last couple of years, and now as more investors coming into the sector? Have you seen more providers come into the sector? And what advice would you be giving to new investors looking to come into the sector to work with providers? Because of course there's some great and there's some that aren't so great. You talked about quite deeply in terms of the due diligence that you've got to do on providers, the balance sheets, etc. What advice would you be giving to new investors coming into working with a provider, whatever type of sort of care that they provide?
I think people find it so hard to connect with supported living providers that when they make a connection, they're just so thrilled. They don't really think that they need to do that due diligence on the provider. They're like, oh, I've got a relationship with someone who wants property, and they're really chuffed with it. And they kind of just jump ahead rather than thinking, actually, this is a long-term relationship I'm entering into with this provider. I need to really make sure, as you say, I need to do my due diligence on them. I need to understand who they are, what their goals. There's so much to go into on that due diligence piece around providers, but you need to take it seriously and you need to really look into it and understand that you are getting into a serious relationship with a provider. You asked about providers coming into the space, and there are an awful lot of new providers coming in. They're being pushed. A lot of providers who provide domiciliary care, like home care for people, are being told by local authorities, actually, why don't you do supported living? And being pushed towards supported living contracts. And also some of them are finding from a staffing point of view, it's easier. because from a staff point of view, the staff are in one place for the whole day, possibly if they're there providing 24-hour support for somebody, rather than having to be drip drap around the place doing 20-minute visits in lots of different people. So sometimes it can be more appealing for staff retention as well to look at supported living. So I think there are a lot of new providers coming into the supported living space. And I think you're right to point that out. A lot of them maybe are very, very new, and the whole concept of taking on a property and leasing a property is a whole new thing for them to suddenly get their heads around and understand, what they need to do. So I think it is, there's a lot of things as a property investor. If you're looking at leasing your property to a provider, you do need to take that really seriously and check them out properly.
For sure. And in terms of from your experience, obviously, if we touch on providers again, there's obviously, as a property investor with any strategy, there's obviously, if we sort of try and put ourselves in the provider's shoes, what challenges are they going through? Because obviously there's funding, there's obviously, you mentioned new ones are taking on long leases, and they've got to be 110% that they can take a lease for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, depending on how long, of course, the agreement is. But what challenges as a provider, what are they facing day in, day out? And maybe for property investors looking to get into the sector, they've got to understand really what they're facing as well, because then it understands how you collaborate, obviously, effectively and efficiently and work together. So talk to us about some of the challenges providers have to go through day in, day out when it comes to working within the sector.
I think the two things that most providers that I speak to find the hardest are staffing at the moment. Staffing is really hard. We've all heard about the care crisis, about the lack of staff, care staff, and that's very, very real. And I know a lot of big providers who are turning down contracts at the moment because they can't get staff. So staffing is a massive issue. Whether you're a small provider or a big provider, staffing is a big problem at the moment. And then finding the property. They're the two things that when providers are taking on supported living contracts, they seem to be their two biggest headaches. But they then also, as a new provider, there's a whole load of regulation they need to go through. I know you've got a CQC inspector coming on, but they need to, if they're providing personal care, get that CQC status, and that's not easy. That's been backlogged by COVID as well. So there's long delays in that process. So I think the setting up a care company, people kind of think it's a quick process, but actually it can take a year, 2 years to get everything sorted, and quite a considerable chunk of investment as well to get everything lined up. So there is a lot of challenges for providers, and I think it's also understanding the provider's background and how much experience they have around that, which really helps. And you pick that up when you're talking to them, but you'll understand someone who's been in the care sector for the last 20 years and want to run their own care company because they actually have seen it, they've got a really good idea of how it can be run better, to someone who's maybe been sat, I don't know, as an accountant for the last 3 years and thinks, actually, the numbers look nice, I'd like to do that. They're very, very different prospects coming into the space. For
sure. And, just a final question on providers, and I think what I've realised in my own journey with supported living, you can pick up the phone and you can speak to LinkedIn or whoever, or whatever angle you're looking at it from. You can speak to 1,000,001 different providers. What advice, I know you do quite a lot in supported living gateway. Is it advisable to be working with a number of providers at once, or do you try and just put all your eggs in one basket with one good provider? And probably it's a question sometimes that you may get asked, and it's like, how many should I actually work with? I'm looking in Cheshire East, for example. Cheshire East, as you know, there's a massive demand from the commissioners right now. There's massive. And there's every single provider I speak to, they're like, oh, yes, Jay. But do I go with one provider who's, not a new one, but a solid one, or do I speak to 5 or 6? What advice would you be giving me in that situation?
It's a really, really good question, Jake. And I think it depends on your growth strategy as well, how ambitious you are, how many properties you want to be developing, and how ambitious the provider is that you have the good relationship with. So if those ambitions match, then you could consider just working with that one provider if you feel that they have got, they're solid, that you feel that their growth is going to work. And I know some people who do that. They've grown their property business alongside a care business. They've got a really lovely relationship. It works really well. They kind of both support each other. And I know that's worked really well for some people. Also, you do need to look at risk, and you need to look at whether you're overexposing your property business to the risk of that one care company. So, it's about your due diligence, your risk strategy, and your growth strategy, whether it matches that care provider. I think they're the things you need to look at. I think obviously from a minimizing risk point of view, working with a couple of providers gives you that kind of balance, doesn't it? But sometimes they all have different approaches, and that can be confusing to work with and challenging. And sometimes just having that one matched company that works really well and you guys have a really good relationship with can be a great way to grow.
For sure. No, definitely. It's, my background's been a lot of in capital raising, speaking to a lot of institutions who family offices, etc. And it's similar to, you can speak to all these funds, right? And you can speak to them all. They all want the same thing. They all want to spend the money. And I think that you speak to a lot of these providers, they all want to, of course, provide care, of course. And it's like, you're definitely right. Sometimes it's almost overwhelming, confusing, right? I've got 20 providers looking for 20 different things. It's like, well, what's my angle with this? And I think it's trying to sort of keep it simple. But yeah, definitely, I think you're right. It's that growth strategy. Does it align? And, I think I always talk about people, does that, from a funding point of view, does that capital partner work and align with what you're trying to achieve? And it's similar to probably, a provider. Does that provider, align with a similar goal that you've got? And I wanted to take you back, Lisa, because, we talked about, when you speak to a new provider, for example, within a couple of minutes, you can sort of work out where their sort of feelings are with the care sector. Are they in this just for numbers? Have you actually got the experience? Your journey has been as a registered nurse and worked within the NHS, worked within the sector for a number of years. How has that journey been? Talk to us about that, and what lessons have you learned from that experience that you've done over the last 20 years that have now led you to do some incredible things at Support Living Gateway?
It's really interesting, isn't it? So my nursing background is as an acute adult nurse. I was an A&E sister for a long time, so I wasn't in the supported living space as a nurse. And so it was a real chance thing that led me into supported living and into property. But from a nursing point of view, I think nurses are really good at underestimating the value and the skills that they learn in nursing that are transferable. And I was certainly guilty of that. You suddenly realize that actually the ability you have when, as a nurse who's met hundreds, thousands of people in clinical settings, you kind of learn to assess people quickly. You get a good measure of people. Your communication skills are really good generally. You learn all of these skills that actually are hugely transferable and actually really lead you to understand people. And with all business, whether that's property, whatever it is, communication is so key, isn't it? It's so important, understanding people, listening, taking on board what they're saying. And those skills, those kind of soft skills that people often underestimate, are actually really, really essential to good business and good growth, really, I think. So I think nursing does bring a whole load of different things that, like I said, I didn't really appreciate. I think I also found when I started getting into property and I'd be in rooms with young men who've got lots of money to throw around, shall we say. There's not necessarily their money, but they think they're very, very important because they've got some money to throw around, and they think they're very, very clever because they've got some money to throw around. And I kind of was sitting in these rooms thinking, I've spent my whole career with these really bright, amazing young people, generally women in nurses, but not all of them, lots of great men as well, nursing, who are incredibly bright, who'd all run rings around you from an intelligence point of view, yet they're earning peanuts and you guys are sat in this room earning big lots of money. And that kind of positioning was really interesting for me to kind of get my head around and really think about the differences in, how we value things in society. And, a lot of money is valued, isn't it? Far more than nursing is. But I think, as I said, I think nurses just don't appreciate the skills they bring. And I think the nurses that I know who have transitioned into doing their own business, and there's quite a lot of us in different ways, actually bring a whole wealth of experience and skills to it.
For sure. No, it's very interesting. I speak to the CQC individual that I mentioned, the inspector coming on, and he's been in the care since late 70s, 80s. The skills that he brings. He's a businessman as well. He's chairman and non-exec for a number of different care groups. But it starts with that care background. He always talks about it's that people first. And, I think a lot of the time when, as you see the support living sector massively growing, you see a lot of funds, institutions, it's crazy the amount of capital coming into the sector. But if you haven't got that solid team that have worked within care before and understood the frontline element, it's very short-lived. The longevity and the sort of vision with it is sort of a bit muffled, really, because all you focus on is money. And I think it's credit to you, in terms of what you do now with Support Living Gateway, and be great to find out a bit more about that for people that obviously come across that. I've just to give you some information, guys. I was on a webinar with Support Living Gateway a number of months ago, and just incredible to see what you guys are doing. The connecting the dots between providers, investors, and what it's all about. So for people that haven't come across Support Living Gateway, talk to us about that, Lisa. What it's all about, what are the plans for the next 12 months, where did it all come from, and what it's all about, really.
So I kind of have to take you back to how I found supported living to kind of explain it, really. So I ended up doing a little bit of property investing, kind of by chance, just let me give this a go, see what happens. And I was randomly approached, and it was completely randomly approached by a housing association asking me if I would pick up a deal. What's this? Sounds interesting. And basically they'd had a landlord pull out of buying a bungalow. And so I naively went, that sounds really interesting. Let me find out more about it. Knew nothing about what I was going into really at all. And ended up developing a bungalow for a young man with very complex learning disabilities who needed a lot of adaptations in the property. And I loved the process of it because it felt like my nurse brain and my property brain and a kind of bit of common sense mum brain all thrown in together meant we could kind of problem solve how to make this property work for this young man. And did a whole load of adaptations. But I got really penalised as a landlord. I got it massively downvalued. The surveyor didn't understand what I'd done and just felt like I'd ruined this property. They couldn't see the value of the lease I'd got on the property. They couldn't see the value of the fact I created a home for life and had a tenant for life. I then struggled to get it insured. I struggled to get a mortgage on it. Everything kind of from a landlord point of view kind of went wrong. At the same time, the local authority were like, Lisa, this is amazing. They were using it as a case study of collaboration. Literally everyone in the local authority traipsed through that bungalow when it was finished to have a look at it. And the care providers locally were all going, Lisa, that's brilliant. We need 3 of those. We need 2 of those. And I was like, I've just been stung. I've left far too much money in that deal than I wanted to. But it felt like there was this really big need to for more properties. And I kind of set me out on a bit of a journey as to understand why property investors, private property investors don't invest in supported living. The big funds are, like you talked to, there's lots of institutional money being thrown at it. But why as private landlords are we not looking at this? Why are we not addressing it? Why are we not meeting this need? So I kind of reached out on social media, created and tried to find anyone else doing supported living, searched all the Facebook groups, really couldn't find anyone this was a few years ago, couldn't find anyone talking about supported living anywhere. And I was like, this is nuts. There must be people out there. So I set up a Facebook group kind of as a stake in the sand to say, anyone else who's doing this, come here, let's talk about it and see who else there is. And then from that kind of grew connections that I made, got to know some other people who were doing this. And we kind of realized there was very much a need for a way for property investors to connect with care providers. So Supported Living Gateway came out of the collective experiences of the 5 of us who formed it. And we've got really diverse backgrounds. So Russ's background is in construction. He's had his own construction company and been building and developing properties for a long time. And he found quite a few years ago that actually supported living was a brilliant exit for some of the schemes he was developing. So he had those connections. He'd already seen that we needed this space. Mark and Leah's background is in the city and they bring a whole wealth of kind of knowledge and legal stuff. And Rich's background is in the military, but he's actually also let properties to supported living providers throughout his military career and found it was an easy way when he was overseas to let properties and not have to be a hands-on landlord. So we kind of brought our collective experience together and realized there needed to be a way for us to create like a matching service for people with property for those providers who needed it. So that was the vision behind Gateway, was making it easier for everyone to connect, for those providers to be able to go to one place to find property when they need it for supported living schemes all over the place. And then out of that has kind of grown, I don't know, it's kind of got, with the training side of it was never, this property trading is so murky, isn't it? That was never going to be anything that we did. I was never going to be involved in property trading. It's this horrible dark world. But so many people were asking us to mentor them or teach them that actually it seemed better to create a training course where actually we could go, okay, this is all the knowledge that we have. It's all here. There you go. So we've done that. So we've created a training course. We've run it 4 times now. It's an 8-week course and the next one's in February. So, people who want to get a really in-depth knowledge and learn how to use this strategy properly, we run that course. And then we realized, and we kind of knew this from early on, that there was a need for a buy to order service for property investors. Were coming to us and saying, well, where do I buy my next property? And the providers at the same time were saying, well, what I really need is this detached 2-bed bungalow in this area and no one's got one. And how do I get a property investor to buy that for me? So that's where our buy to order service has kind of sprung from, is that need, that desire to actually go, okay, let's get the providers to list what it is they need. And then our property investors can go, all right, fine, my next investment, it could actually be that bungalow for that provider because that would suit me. It's in my area. It would work really well for me. And so that matching is a way to meet that need. So it's really exciting because talking to the providers, they're really excited about it. They struggle with property, as I've said. It's a difficulty for them. And there are so many people who need properties. I kind of spend, like yesterday, I had one of those depressing days where every phone call I had was with someone who was in desperate need for a property, whether we're talking about young asylum seekers who were sleeping on the streets in London, whether we're talking about, 5 individuals in hospital in Bristol in long-term learning disability institutions when they should be in their own homes in the community. community. There are so many people who need good quality properties, and actually as private landlords we can meet that demand. We can, most of us have a property that would meet the needs of supported living providers, or actually we're looking for our next investment, so why not be something that's going to make a real difference to somebody? So yes, I think it's really exciting. There's lots of exciting stuff coming.
It's incredible. And and definitely I always tell people, if you're looking to get into the sector, definitely get educated, and I think that's very key, especially when working with providers. So if you are looking to get into the sector, definitely check out the training program, because that's especially when it comes to supported living, this is not just a standard buy to let, as much as there is obviously ways to make it simple and of course efficient. Make sure you get educated, guys, because I think a lot of people looking to get into the sector just want to buy property and get a 10-15 year lease and off we go and off to the sunset. And unfortunately, if it was like that, everyone would be doing it. But in terms of the sector right now, and obviously with supported living gateway, and growing that, because I think it's incredible what you've been able to do, that buy to order service. What challenges have you sort of faced with supported living gateway? Sounds great, bring loads of providers on board, brings loads of investors. How easy is it to connect that? Obviously it seems like great demand, and put them two together. But what challenges are you facing internally? Not necessarily challenges, from limiting growth or anything like that. But what's the sticking point? What seems to be the sort of the difficulties when connecting the two parties between each other?
I think education, I think awareness and understanding on both sides. Sometimes you have your property investors who are like, I need £8 million a week for this property, even though it really isn't ever going to need, it's worth £200 a week or whatever, and so sometimes property investors not understanding it, having this very high ideal of what they think they need. Saying that, most of our providers will pay market rent, but people, for some reason, some people think, oh, it's supported living, I can add zeros onto it, which isn't how it works, because that money has to come from somewhere. The providers not understanding property, and that's a real problem, because they a lot of them are brilliant at the care. They don't necessarily understand property. They don't know how to do a property viewing. They don't know how to check out a property online before they go and view it. So sometimes we've had providers come back from a viewing and say, yeah, but it's right on a main road. And you're like, did you not think to look on Street View before you viewed it? And they're like, oh no, how would I do that? So, us realizing that and having to do more training and more support of the providers around the property, so that they understand the property side of things better to help them, is very much something we've needed. So that mismatch between rent sometimes and that expectation, time as well. So property investors, yourself, Jake, we like things done yesterday. We want our properties let, we want everything to happen really quickly, because that's how we work. We work at 100 miles an hour. Care providers and local authorities do not. So therefore you'll get a care provider going, oh yeah, I really like it, I need to speak to the commissioner, and that decision takes 2, 3, 4 weeks to get back from the commissioner, by which time the property investors had enough. It feels like they're being messed around. So a lot of it is communication, and a lot of it is people understanding it and realizing how it all works, but I think it is there's some of the mismatches, but we kind of see ourselves as a translation service, almost sitting in the middle, trying to help everyone communicate, because they are very different worlds and people do work in very different ways. And so it's trying to bridge that gap and help people come together to get properties that work for everyone, really.
No, I couldn't agree more. And, you touched on commissioners there. It's something that I've certainly realised, when I've been on commissioning calls, CCGs, and, had these conversations, and some commissioners are very proactive, of course, like Cheshire East, for example, they're screaming out for property at the moment. Salford, for example, they're sort of taking a sort of step back and sort of working out where, it's all these sort of conversations. And I've realised when I brought John, the CQC inspector, on the call, the conversation has gone from me just saying, hey, I'm Jake, I'm a property investor looking to build a relationship. Like, oh yeah, we've heard this time again. But then I bring John on, the CQC, and it's like, wow, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's been in the care for the last 30, 40 years. When it comes to working with commissioners, Lisa, because I think sometimes people forget who commissioners are in many ways. I think there's provider, property, great, happy days, and then like, oh, you need to speak to commission. You've had it before, like as you mentioned, it can take weeks to get a solid answer. Sometimes it can obviously be a lot quicker. But what advice would you be giving to new property investors looking to work with commissioners? And I think it's important to have those relationships, of course. But there's a lot of people that, like you said, that's like, oh, it's taking too long. This, how can we speed it up? And sometimes it's out of your control, of course. But what advice would you be giving to new investors looking to work with commissioning groups up and down the country?
I think understanding the pressures they're under. Property is a tiny, tiny part of their job. It's, it's your world entirely as a property investor, but it's a tiny, tiny bit of what they do. So although it's important and really important to get it right, you're not the most important person in their world. So you have to kind of realize that you are quite bottom of the tree, if you like. You have to realize you need to make their life easier for them. You need to be super polite, have solutions when they need them, be available, respond to them super quickly if they do communicate with you. But also don't expect to, as a new property investor, to reach out to every commissioner. I really think it's not achievable, and I think you're just going to create overwhelm, and it's not actually going to help anybody in the system, because they don't want to, and they don't have the capacity to speak to every new property investor in an area who's going, oh well, possibly I'd quite like to work with you, I might be able to buy you a 1-bed flat somewhere. That's not really going to help them. So actually your care providers are your way to the commissioner. They have a much better relationship with the commissioner, with the local authority, probably than you're going to, unless you're doing really big schemes or you've got something very special to offer them. You're probably not going to have that direct relationship with the commissioner. So I think I would kind of manage your expectations around that. They do make a lot of decisions. They're very important, but they wear so many hats in local authority, and they're really, really stretched. They don't have the time to just have a bit of a chat with you, much as you would love that. That's
Sure.
not necessarily how it works.
No, it's certainly something I've realised, and you speak to them, and you're definitely right. Ultimately, I think people when they work with commissioners, they think, oh, that's just their job role to sign off properties, give the letter of support, and it's like you said, it's a tenth of what it actually they do day to day.
And then you throw COVID in, and most of them had to do COVID emergency response to different things as well. So they're running so many different bits that, absolutely.
Sure. And just going back to Support Living Gateway, Lisa, connecting that, bridging that gap, connecting the dots between investors and providers. Where do you see new investors coming into the sector going wrong? Because I think it's important to understand what works and what doesn't work, of course. And we talk about education, we talk about other things, but managing expectations is obviously key. But I think when it comes to a new investor coming into the sector, what are the key things that you see that investors should avoid from day one? And what are the things that they could improve on? Because I think it's important to establish that, because I'm an investor looking to scale in the sector, and obviously I'm asking advice from an expert like yourself and me, but also people looking to get in the sector. People always ask me, because I'm on socials like yourself, and people are always like, oh, Jake, want to do what you do in many ways. I'm just like, I'm not the expert here, but where do you see people go wrong as a new investor coming into the sector right now?
I think exit finance is difficult in supported living. So making sure that you are as mortgageable as you can be, because if you have any restrictions to your mortgageability, then supported living mortgages are even harder to get hold of. So thinking about your exit finance early. So, you have that, you get through to that care provider, you make all these promises, but actually you can't possibly get a mortgage, and you're never going to be able to get that property finance, then you're going to be the unreliable link in the chain. So making sure that you can get supported living finance is one thing very key. I think being aware of those timescales, so engaging with providers early. If you've got a property in refurb that you think could be suitable for supported living, engage with that provider really early. I mean, if you want to bung it on the gateway, if you want to, get our providers to have a look at it, but do it as early as you can in the refurb. It's very different to, when you're taught on property training courses, wait till you've got a perfect finished property and it's beautiful and then put it with a letting agent. Not at all in this situation. As soon as you own it, exchange on it, put it on the gateway, get providers to have a look at it with your vision. I think this could be a 5-bed HMO, but it could be a 4-bed HMO with a staff office, or it could be this, or it could be, divided up in a slightly different way. Then the providers can engage with you early, get on board with you and understand your vision for the property, but also then put their stamp on that and say, actually, do you know what? It's perfect, but could you put 2 extra fire doors and a smoke alarm here? Yeah, easy. Or rather than putting that bathroom in, can you put an adapted wet room? If you're doing that in the refurb, then that's really easy to do, isn't it? You just do it as part of your refurb. So I think, so those things I think are key. And like we both have said this, but time, just realizing things don't happen fast. You're looking at the long-term gain in supported living. So it takes longer to get set up. It takes longer to get a supported living scheme established than it would be just to bung it on, Rightmove or with a letting agency, especially at the moment, because landlords are feeling no pain, are they? Properties are let in minutes. As soon as they're advertised, you've got a waiting list of people wanting to view the property. But it's looking at the longer picture of the fact that you're not going to have voids in that time that the property's leased. They're going to cover wear and tear, maintenance, bits and pieces within the lease. So you're looking at your bigger picture and understanding it's going to take a bit more time and a bit more energy up front to get those long-term goals.
For sure. I couldn't be more than that. It's that long-term vision, isn't it? I think longevity is key with supported living. Dream team and the power team, whatever you want to call it, is always key. A key word, or 2 words within property development and property. When you're looking to scale as a property investor, there's who you need around you. Your circle of people, your construction guys, your architects, whoever it may be. does that dream team change when it comes to supported living? You know, there's obviously two sides to this really. There's care and there's obviously property. You know, would you advise more people to get more people from the care world on part of their dream team? Or would you, you know, work with a supported living gateway, for example? You know, like I've always, you know, I've got the award-winning care architect, I've got the CQC guy, for example. Whether or not I'm making the right decision, I don't know. You know, but what does the dream team look like when trying to scale and be successful within supported living right now?
It's a really good question. I think the thing you need in your pocket as well is a lease reader and someone who's going to write your lease or support you and read someone else's lease. So I think that's something that you don't need as a private property investor because you just use an AST. So you need someone who's going to give you that good advice around your lease. That's someone extra you need in your team, I would say. I think you're right. I think if you can demonstrate that the team you're working with have experience in this sector, it makes you more marketable to the care providers and the housing associations you might be working with. So I think it's no bad thing, but I wouldn't feel put off by that. I think on the bigger schemes, they're really helpful when you're looking at blocks of flats and some, you know, scaling things. But actually, a lot of the providers want single properties. A lot of them want a 2-bed house. They want a 1-bed flat somewhere. They don't necessarily want huge blocks of properties. So actually, those properties that you have as a property investor, don't feel that they don't have value in supported living, because they really do. And so many of the providers actually are moving away from the bigger schemes towards the smaller individualized properties that are dispersed in the community, where people can just feel part of the community. So I think for those ones, you don't need to have your architect and, you know, all of that stuff. So I think I would caution people to not feel worried about it and feel that they need to. It's very easy to undervalue the skills you bring as a property investor to care providers. I've had an interesting week this week where I've been trying to rewrite the spec that an occupational therapist has given me for a property that is things like, I'd quite like soundproofing, maybe those foam tiles. She thinks that's the spec for a builder, you know, and so I'm kind of going, right, okay, let's unpick that and go through exactly what you mean and work it through. And as a property investor, you're used to writing specs and dealing with builders and knowing what needs to be there. So you bring a huge amount of skills, you know, that it's very easy not to. And another example was that, you know, viewing properties with care providers, a perfect derelict bungalow with a big attached double garage. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. And they're like, it's awful. What would you do with it, Lisa? It's terrible. I can't see how. And I'm like, can you not see this would be a brilliant, we can put all the hoisting through this double thing here. We can have a huge accessible bathroom in this double garage. Oh, could we? All right. How would you do that? You know, that vision that as a property investor, you're used to walking into buildings and going, oh, we can do this, this, and this. Not everyone has that ability. And until you start doing viewings with people who don't understand how to think like that, do you realize how much value that is?
No, couldn't agree more. You know, you're definitely right. It's that, you know, it's that lease element, which is key. I think, you know, sometimes a lot of people, you know, some of these leases, I was reading one the other day, it's 75, 80 pages, you know, and they're long. You know,
yeah, they're awful. I hate them.
You know, you look at AST, which is, you know, no more than a couple of pages sometimes. It's crazy, isn't it? Right, you know, you bring a lot of skills to the table. You know, it's that, you know, working off each other's strengths in many ways. And, you know, the care obviously bring their incredible value to the table, but also as a property investor, you're bringing, you know, the properties where these individuals are going to be living in. You know, scalability is a topic which, you know, as you mentioned, property investors are always 100 miles an hour, looking for the next deal, looking to scale, looking to make it happen. And sometimes I think a lot of new investors come into sectors like, oh, you know, it's not as scalable sometimes as they once thought because of the time, because of maybe the money, the exit situation. You know, of course, if you get it right, there's obviously ways you can do it. And like with any business and business model, you can obviously scale it. How would a new investor who maybe sat on £500,000, £1 million, looking to come into the sector right now, buy a couple of properties, for example, and really, you know, make the mark and obviously get it right, how do you advise that investors looking to scale in the sector, which is, you know, does bring its hurdles, but, you know, hurdles that can be overcome, no problem at all?
I think it's understanding the demand in the areas that you want to invest in. I think it's also looking at exit strategies and not being so set that this has to, you have to remember you're buying an expensive asset. And people, again, get so excited by the fact they've got a provider on board and they're buying this property for them. They forget that actually, if the lease expires in 5 years' time, they might be stuck with this expensive asset. And can they actually use it as a private rental, as a serviced accommodation, as a student let, whatever, you know, so looking at your exit strategies. But I think from a scaling point of view, it's about Yeah, understanding the demand, listening to what people need rather than thinking what you need, I think is really, really key. And don't try and push people down a rabbit hole of, oh, but this property could work. It's perfect. Look, it's, a block of 20 flats. I think it's really, really perfect for supported living. Actually listening to the provider, he said right at the beginning of the conversation, the maximum I want is 12 flats. Or don't push the 20 block on them because they only want 12 as a maximum. I think obviously, that's what our buy to order service is about people being able to go, okay, fine, here's the exact demand, let's buy that to order. So, that way, or invest with other people and learn. I think that's a really key thing. I'm sure, Jake, you'll happily take their 500,000, I'll happily take their 500,000 and show them what they can do with it. But, I think if you're looking at it and learning about it, then find people who are doing it already and invest with them to understand how to do it, and how to work within this sector and how to kind of meet people's needs. But it is listening, it's communicating and understanding what's actually needed.
For sure. No, couldn't agree more, Lisa. And, the future of supported living, you mentioned about the problems that, councils and boroughs up and down the country face at the moment. People out of area, for example, my mum works within Manchester City Council, and she's, in terms of asylum seekers, there's hotels at the moment where there's 600 families in city centre hotels, expensive hotels, and the only properties that they've got available are in Kent or Scotland. And, it's like you've got 600 families here, young children, of course, looking to get into these, we're trying to sort of work out if there's an angle and what we can do. But it's that property, providing enough property, because, you can provide a few, but 600 families is very different to 2 or 3 properties. Where do you see the future of supported living right now? And where do you see it over transition over the 18 months? There's obviously a lot of noise. A lot of people coming into the sector, which is obviously exciting. There's a lot of great people being able to provide more property, a lot of great providers being able to provide more care and services. What is the future for supported living on a bigger picture? Where do you see the changes happening? Do you see anything sort of that's working at the moment or not so working? What's the future from Supported Living Gateway in your personal eyes that'll help the industry moving forward in the future?
I think moving away from those very long leases that works really well. As a landlord, they're lovely. I've got 40-year lease on my property and I get paid this much money and it goes up every year, and isn't that lovely? But actually looking at whether that actually fits everyone else in the system. So it's about sustainability in the system and about the leases being sustainable. So the providers, the housing associations we work with constantly struggle with this. They want security of tenure. They want the fact that actually if this individual moves into this property, they want it to be their home for life. But they also do need that flexibility that they're not tied in for 40 years because actually it might not suit them in the next 2 years. And then how do they move forward with that? And it's a constant struggle to get that balance where you've got security of tenure versus lease length. But I think I very much see them move down in lease lengths to more sustainable lengths around the 10, 15 years for bigger blocks, and maybe 3 to 5 to 7 years for smaller individual properties. And that works fine. As a landlord, if you offer me a 5-year lease on my property, I'll take that any day, because I've got no voids in those 5 years. Someone's looking after it from me. I don't need to be greedy and want 25 years. The chances are if that works and someone's settled in that home, it's going to be renewed. So it's looking at the bigger picture and understanding how it works for everybody, and not just being, as the landlord, a bit greedy at the top of the tree, thinking you want all of it. Because actually, generally what's happened with those long leases is it's meant that the property's not been maintained. So the cost, there is a cost somewhere in the system. So yeah, the landlord's doing really nicely out of that, but actually there isn't enough money to maintain the property, or the care at some level is being knocked back. And so it's looking at actually how it all fits together, communicating again. I know I bang on about it, but understanding how everyone else's demands. But I think very much from a sector-wide point of view, looking at that lease length, I can see that's definitely coming down. And I think that's breaking the stranglehold that some of the big funds have had over this space, where they've kind of said, oh, we'll buy your property, little care provider, but you have to sign up for a 25-year lease. They've had no other way to get hold of that property. So they've been tied into having to sign those leases. And I hear horror stories all the time about people who are trapped in those leases that doesn't work for people. So I think, and it's something the regulator's working on. It's something that, this is coming from lots of different angles, but I think that's the big trend that I think is definitely happening.
For sure. It's complicated, isn't it, in many ways? And, it's trying to sort of make it simple. That's obviously what you guys are doing at Supported Living Gateway, is trying to make it as, simple, even though it's not simple, and, understanding it for new investors coming into the sector. But, Lisa, I appreciate all the answers to the questions today. I always round off a podcast with a traditional sort of question, and it's a 2-part question, really. It's not anything too crazy, don't worry. But it's a question that I'm always interested, because I interview sort of leaders all around the world within the property space. Obviously, part of the care series is obviously, why I want to get you on board. But the two questions are, a quote or a sort of mantra that you live by in terms of if there's any internal, maybe it's supporting the gateway or yourself. It can be, we've had some crazy, wacky quotes, for example, but it's more whatever you want to sort of call it. And also coffee. If we were to meet for coffee in Manchester or wherever you are, and we were to sit down at Costa or a nice coffee shop, what coffee would we go for? So what are those two answers to those two questions?
I'm not a coffee drinker, I'm a tea drinker, so it would be a cup of tea, a proper bog standard cup of tea, I'm afraid, is what I'd be ordering if we were sat down in Costa somewhere. And quotes, it's not an exciting flashy quote, but it's the fact you only get one life and life is precious. I think working in A&E for a long time really drills that into you. Every day you see people who just left their homes thinking their day was going to be normal, and it ended in a very, very different way. And I think seeing those experiences as a young woman, and realizing that actually how precious life is, and the fact that actually you just need to grab opportunities because life is short and precious. So yeah, that's mine.
Amazing. Well, I'm sure we'll be meeting for a cup of tea very soon, and yeah, I appreciate all your time, appreciate all your answers today. It's been incredible. And definitely check out Lisa on social media. You're here, there and everywhere, of course. And of course, what you guys are doing at Support Learning Gateway is incredible, and it's amazing to see the change and the value that you're adding to the sector. So credit to you guys, and hope to see more coming soon.
Thanks, Jake. Thank you.
Thank you.